I sometimes talk to guys who worry about the rage they feel inside, who worry about the kind of, rage, aggression. And these are guys who aren't acting this out and who will probably never act this out. So these aren't guys who have a problem with aggression or rage in terms of their way of behaving. They're not abusive whatsoever. They're really good people, but they worry about the secret rage they feel inside, and then often feel a kind of shame about that. Well, there's a few things to say. One is that one way of thinking about virtue is that a virtue is you actually overcoming something. It's a strength where you overcome a temptation or whatever it is. So, for example, if a person's not scared and they run into battle, are they courageous? So maybe it requires being afraid in order for you to be courageous. If you're not afraid at all, maybe you're just rash. That's one way of thinking about it. Virtue theory actually is pretty sophisticated, and it's sort of it has sort of levels of virtue. If you think about Aristotle or Socrates, that you can perceive in their philosophy a notion of levels of virtue. And so the person who has no courage, has no fear to start off with, they're not actually courageous. Perhaps maybe they're just rash when they rush into battle. Courage is the overcoming of fear. But for these thinkers, in time, you need to overcome the fear as well. So your character is one that you cultivate where you start to overcome even possessing the fears in the first place. And that's a higher level virtue of courage. So applying this to today's example, just because you have rage inside doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Now, it's better to not have that rage in one sense, if that means, working that stuff through. That's a higher virtue, working that stuff through so that you find it in a calm and inner acceptance of life, an inner acceptance of what feels like life's unjustness, its unfairness, and so on. But one other point I want to make around this, and I guess this kind of motivated this reflection, was that I don't think there's any problem whatsoever with having a capacity for aggression or even violence. I don't think there's a problem whatsoever with that. We've needed that for a very long time. We've been around for 200,000 years. We've not been living in nice little politically correct, air-conditioned, safe spaces, which, by the way, were built by people who had to fight, ultimately, to create this modern civilization, because those who wanted to tyrannize us and push back against, the values of the Enlightenment, they did so with swords in their hands. They weren't giving that stuff up. There's no problem with having this aggression inside, or even this rage. A good person is not one who is weak. A good person ultimately is not one who's meek and mild and therefore incapable of harming. That's not really what a good person is. A truly good person, I think, it's a bit like this notion of you need fear in order to be courageous. A truly good person is one who has those things inside and overcomes them. But slight twist on this, a good person is one who has the capacity to do harm and then acts justly out of that. Why do I say that? Well, because they have the capacity actually to fight for what's right. I mean, what is goodness if it's not a capacity to actually fight and hopefully fight effectively? That's for what's right. You're not always going to win, so your intent matters, but it matters a hell of a lot in the real world if you can actually stand up for yourself and stand up for other people. And at the end of the day, when we think of somebody else as being a good person in terms of what they stood up for and their capacity to stand up for it, they had this capacity for aggression and they channeled it. And that's what it's about. It's about channeling these things. The problem is not the possession of these things. We are animals and we possess the full spectrum of good and evil, of peaceableness and violence and so on and so on. It's not a problem, I think, to have these things inside you. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's very common. I'm talking to guys especially who have sort of talked about this to me in counselling. What matters is how you channel it. And you need a capacity you need to be tough. You need a capacity for aggression if you're to be genuinely good, effectively good, when push comes to shove. So no problem at all. When good people have this capacity for aggression inside them, that's a very good thing. When good people have a capacity for power and a capacity for violence, if it's needed, that's a good thing. Nothing to be ashamed of whatsoever.